Hello class, welcome to Chapter 9. This is about training. This chapter discusses the different types of training firefighters can expect to receive over the course of their careers and also discusses the personnel and positions that make up a training bureau and the value and importance of training in the fire service and how adequate training levels and performance standards are determined and the importance of safety in training. So the objectives we're going to cover in this chapter are to identify personnel and positions that make up a training bureau, discuss the value of interagency training, describe training facilities used in the fire service, and describe the purpose and importance of training in the fire service. We will also explain the difference between technical and manipulative training. We will describe how an adequate level of training is determined, describe how performance standards are determined, and then explain how skills are developed. And then we'll conclude with describing the role standard operating procedures play in training. Those are SOPs, standard operating procedures. We will also discuss the importance of maintaining training records and then describe the relationship of training to incident effectiveness. And then conclude with listing areas in which firefighters require training and discussing the importance of safety in that training. Training is of the utmost importance in the fire service. Without training, firefighters are inefficient, possibly ineffective, and exposed to greater risks than is necessary. With the general personnel reduction on engine and truck companies in the modern fire service, the need for efficient and effective operational skills is more crucial. Many municipalities have reduced staffing on apparatus and reduced the number of fire stations serving an area. This has resulted in reduced numbers of personnel available at a scene to perform diverse firefighting functions. There are many challenges in properly training firefighters, including small departments with small budgets, large departments with inadequate training budgets, volunteer organizations, and volunteer firefighters may have difficulty taking time away from their jobs and businesses to attend the National Fire Academy. Their department may not have dedicated training funds to bring in instructors or send people to courses and seminars. The hazards and risks faced by firefighters are much the same in any size department. All firefighters face the challenge of changing technology such as alternative fueled vehicles and lightweight construction. It's getting harder to keep up with training as more laws and regulations, both state and federal, are passed requiring training for firefighters. And it is getting harder to retain volunteer members due to the sheer volume of training they must undergo. In dire circumstances, the only thing that may save you is your training. For example, you're alone inside a burning structure and running out of air in your SCBA. You cannot even see your hand in front of your face and you're totally disoriented. The heat is starting to increase tremendously and your ears feel as if they are on fire. And you begin asking yourself questions such as, how did I get in this situation? What should I do? Should I stand up and run? Do I do the low crawl and try to find a doorway? What has happened to the rest of my crew? As panic starts to set in, you have one thing to rely on that moment, and that is your training. You must not let panic overcome you and reduce you to helplessness. And you need some idea of where to go and how to get there. You should be able to make the decisions to save your own life. Every year, a number of firefighters are injured or killed in structure fire-related training accidents. Training must be administered in a methodical manner by knowledgeable and experienced professionals. Practical simulations are necessary for realistic training, but they must not be taken to the point of unnecessary risk. One example of a training exercise that had grave results is the 18-year-old Connecticut firefighter who died after falling from a ladder during training in 2005. NFPA 1403, which is the standard on live firefighter training evolutions, was developed after several firefighters were killed in a training accident. It is essential to be prepared because your life safety depends on it. You will need to pay attention in classes and drills, and you will also need to practice and maintain your skills. After firefighter fatalities in the line of duty, investigations are made and reports are written. These reports are made available on the internet, so that many fatalities, no matter what type of firefighting, have common denominators. So we must gather and examine information available to us so we do not become case history ourselves. We must also pay strict attention to material already available. Most of the material was developed after firefighters lost their lives. One of the primary focuses of fire-related conferences and grant proposals is the issue of training. It is one of the greatest needs in fire and emergency services. Innovations such as the positive pressure ventilation fan that we talked about in a previous chapter, also known as the power fan, are developed on almost a daily basis. These innovations can make us more efficient and provide a wider margin of safety in a very dangerous profession. If firefighters do not avail themselves of this information, they are at fault. Training is a career-long commitment that all emergency service personnel must make. The personnel of the Training Bureau devote their time and effort to preparing firefighters to do their job safely and efficiently, both on the everyday incidents and under extraordinary circumstances. Their job requires them to stay abreast of the latest developments in firefighting technique and safety. They plan, prepare, and present this information to operating personnel. Training staff varies from one department to another. Small departments may have only one person in charge of training, whereas a larger department might have a complete training staff. Regardless of the size and capabilities of the department's training staff, firefighters are ultimately responsible for their own safety and education. You'll be the firefighter you choose to be. No one can make you better or worse, so it is in your own best interest to be best educated, most physically fit, and best trained firefighter that you can be. It may just save your own life and or the lives of other firefighters. Now let's talk a little bit about staff or operations function. Some departments look on the Training Bureau as a staff function. The personnel work a 5-day-week schedule and have offices, usually at headquarters or at a training facility. And by working a 5-day schedule, the training staff can get more productive work done in a week than if they were on the operations schedule. However, the personnel in operations often see an imaginary dividing line between themselves and the training staff. Like any other staff position, training personnel are there to support the function of line operations personnel. Without the training staff, the operations personnel may not have the required training to perform safely, efficiently, and in compliance with the law. Instead of viewing the training staff as a group of people who just give them more work to do, operations personnel should view the training staff as a valuable asset to their personal welfare and ability to perform their jobs. In other departments, the training staff is under the command of the operations section. Many in the fire service feel strongly this is where it belongs. Some training officers respond to incidents as safety officers and in other capacities, typically working under the operations chief. Some departments have battalion training officers. An advantage to having training personnel respond to incidents is that they can then view the operations taking place and assessing training and equipment needs and overall performance. Large departments may have stations spread over large geographic areas that differ greatly in the types of incidents they handle. Naturally, in these circumstances, different areas have different strengths and weaknesses. The needs of each area may differ as well. For example, a station in a suburban area performs operations differently than one in a downtown area with high-rise buildings. The training personnel must develop programs that will maintain the proficiency of the outlying companies so they will be able to operate efficiently when called to a fire in the downtown area. The overall requirements for a training officer are varied and can be divided into aptitude and attitude. In terms of aptitude, the training officer must be able to plan effectively. The planning must be flexible enough that a company attending a training session can respond if it is needed to handle an emergency and have the training session resumed when the company returns. The planning also requires coordination of a wide variety of resources. For example, a wildland class may include instructors from various agencies, such as the local fire department, U.S. Forest Service, and Bureau of Land Management. The training officer must make sure that all the personnel are available and understand what portion of the training is required to present. Training officers should go through the training to be certified to the levels of specified in NFPA 1041, which is the standard for fire service instructor personnel qualifications. Training officers must have various attributes and skills. They must have the capacity to research and develop instructional outlines, lesson plans, for personal presentation or presentation by others. They must be able to communicate clearly and concisely, orally and in writing. They must have a credibility to be effective. And this is based on expertise or subject matter knowledge and relationship, the ability to get along with others. They must be able to organize the material they present effectively, building knowledge in a logical sequence. They must be able to develop instructional packages for individual group self-study. The ability to take a video presentation from the concept stage to the completed video is a valuable attribute. With today's technology, training posted to the department's website and video are also viable alternatives. These tools provide for general productions and allow trainers to address issues specific to the needs of certain personnel in a department. For example, a video about the inspection of brakes on fire engines operated by the department. The training officer must be able to present concepts and ideas to groups in a teaching situation, as you see below in Figure 9-1. When you study the material and prepare your lesson plan and make a presentation, you had better know the material in depth. You must not only be able to present it in a logical manner, but also be prepared to answer questions. However, if you need to look into the answer of a question, be sure to get back to the student in a timely fashion. Training others in concepts is probably the hardest material to present. You cannot hold a concept in your hand and point out its features and parts to the class. For example, when presenting the concept of the fire tetrahedron, you cannot show the production of free radicals. Whereas you are instructing in class on the parts of a ladder, you can point them out and show their relation and function to the students. It's much easier to grasp the idea of an item in front of you than to understand a concept or theory. The training officer must have a positive attitude concerning the importance of training. The officer must understand the importance of training and its relationship to the organization as a whole. A training officer should have experience in as many of the department's areas of activity as possible. There is no substitute for experience when it comes to having credibility in the eyes of one's peers. The training officer must have demonstrated initiative in past assignments and be a self-starter. The person must be able to work with minimum supervision on complicated projects. As a whole, the members of the Training Bureau, with respect to their rank, have the greatest effect on the policies of the department. The training officer has the ability to effect change in the overall direction of the department on a regular basis. When a company officer trains his or her crews to do things a certain way, the only personnel affected are those under his or her direct control. When the Training Bureau writes new policy or procedure, it can change operations in every fire station in the department. Along with the training officer's capability to implement change is the exposure to scrutiny by the whole department. When the Training Bureau develops a course or program, everyone in the department sees the results. The company officer's work is seen by only the immediate subordinates and supervisor. If the company officer makes a mistake when the training officer makes a mistake, almost everyone is aware of it. This leads to a greater responsibility to perform top quality work, as well as assisting in setting trends for the future and providing for the safety and efficiency of everyone in the department. Then there's the training chief. The overall responsibility for the Training Bureau is usually given to a person of chief's rank, and the reasons for this are that this function has a lot of responsibility and importance, and a high rank position also lends more authority to his or her decisions when it comes to recruiting personnel to assist or participate in training programs. Many times the Training Bureau is charged with introducing new procedures and methods to the organization. For them to be accepted requires careful decision making as to their usefulness and method of introduction. One person is often in charge of training overall, which helps establish a coordinated effort. All of the shifts are trained to do the same level on the same material and in the same procedures. This person can also set the tone for the Bureau's activities and lead the planning for a comprehensive program that addresses the department's needs. This person also serves as the central contact person for the higher ranks. It prioritizes the requests that come from them and adjusts the workloads of the training staff accordingly. In situations where the Training Bureau is closely tied with the local college, the Training Bureau's administrator may serve as the liaison officer. The college's fire science representative will most likely be a person with an extensive education background and a master's degree or higher. The fire department representative needs to be able to operate comfortably on this level. And now we're going to talk about company officers. Departments that have a chief officer in charge of training usually have company officers as the primary training officers. These officers schedule the training and arrange the programs, and they also perform much of the actual instruction and needs assessment. In many departments, the training staff prepares and revises the department's operational procedures and administrative procedures. Being a part of this process helps training officers prepare themselves for teaching new procedures to line personnel. The position of training officer aids in preparing oneself for promotion. Furthermore, in many departments, proven effectiveness in a staff position is a prerequisite for promotion. On the downside, the training officer does not often have the same measure of control as an operations company officer. For the most part, the station officer can plan most of the activities of the crew and schedule program work and other functions as he or she sees fit, as long as they fall within department guidelines. The training officer, on the other hand, works on long-term projects when there is time between assisting instructors and handling last-minute changes to schedules. The station can also function in the company officer's absence. When the training officer is at a class or on vacation, the work has a tendency to pile up and be waiting when he or she returns. In many departments, the training bureau must borrow the apparatus it needs from operations to put on a class, such as driver-operator training. This can lead to problems when operations personnel do not deliver the equipment on time or other problems crop up. The training bureau must also return the apparatus in a clean state and good working order, or they will receive complaints from operations. Instructors can be from the same department or multiple departments. They can also be from related agencies such as ambulance companies. Good instructors are made, not born. They attend courses and seminars on presenting instruction. They can learn from observing and speaking with other instructors, and they can access information on training topics and instructional methodology in publications and the internet. They have studied, prepared, and practiced to become comfortable with the material and to develop their presentation style. The personnel of the Training Bureau do not have the time or subject matter expertise to teach every class in a busy department. Part of a training officer's job is to recruit and assist instructors in their presentations. Some areas of expertise are hard to find among fire personnel available to a department. In these cases, the use of civilians is required. For example, the subject of weather and how it relates to wildland fires may require expertise of a local meteorologist. However, the meteorologist is likely to go over the students' heads and may not present the material effectively. Therefore, the training officer will need to carefully coordinate with the instructor as to the expectation for the course and subject matter to be covered. The different qualifications for the different levels of instructor and what is required at each level are contained in NFPA Standard 1041, which is the standard for fire service instructor professional qualifications. I mentioned this earlier. And in this document, instructors are divided into 3 levels, with level 1 being the lowest, level 3 being the highest. Level 1 instructors are able to utilize and prepare material and set up and deliver courses. Level 2 instructors are able to develop lesson plans and evaluate and coordinate activities of other instructions. And Level 3 instructors are able to develop comprehensive training curricula and programs, conduct organization needs analysis, and develop training goals and strategies. In departments that are tied closely with the local college, credit is given for courses. The college can collect money from the students or the state and use it to pay instructors. The National Fire Academy, NFA, uses federal funds to pay its instructors. These instructors are from all over the country, firefighters and civilians included. They are required to apply for acceptance into an instructor course for the subject they wish to teach. On successful completion of the instructor course, they are certified to teach for the NFA. With the increased use of video and other electronic media in today's training environment, an electronic media technician is a valuable resource for any training bureau. One well-planned 10-minute video, podcast, online course, or other method of electronic transmission can be distributed to every station and department and construct all of these shifts very economically. With electronic media, the students can turn off the video when they are called out for an emergency and resume when they return. Members who were absent when the rest of the crew saw the video can view it upon their return. The purchase of electronic media equipment is expensive, but it can return its initial cost in a short time. There are numerous sources of fire and medical related videos on the market. These videos can be used alone or supplemented with department-specific information. The acquisition of electronic media staff and equipment gives the fire department an opportunity to perform this function for other intra- and intra-agency departments and related groups. In addition to buying goodwill, the department can arrange for reimbursement through exchange. This is one way a department does not have to transfer funds to another. Preparing a short video for another department may get you the instructor you want for a particular course at no charge. It also gets the name of your department in front of others in and out of the firefighting profession. It can also enhance your department's image when done properly. A good example of that is Fairfax County, Virginia. They have outstanding training videos and a lot of them. And they've really gone through great effort to present very clear and effective training. And it is one site that you should definitely visit and look for on YouTube. It's Fairfax County, Virginia. Now let's talk about light duty. Numerous departments are requiring that firefighters who are restricted from active duty because of injury go on what is often called light duty and assist the training or other bureaus. They may be given data entry, equipment transfer, or other assignments. Light duty gives the department a way to employ these personnel while they are on injury leave. It also gives the personnel assigned to light duty the benefit exposure to what is required of the training and other staff positions. One of the finest examples of training cooperation is when the fire department jointly trains with other agencies. These agencies can be federal, state, or local. When training with the United States Forest Service, USFS, and the BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, the fire department gets a national perspective on its problems with wildland fires. Through the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, the federal personnel have training resources not normally available on a local level. This group is an association of agencies that develop training and reference materials for wildland firefighting. They also have a qualification system that can prepare local department firefighters to participate in firefighting on a national scale. The USFS and BLM personnel, in turn, gain a new respect for the problems faced by local firefighters in the areas of structural firefighting and hazardous materials. By sharing their expertise, all of the involved agencies gain knowledge and increased effectiveness. On the local level, fire departments that fight fires together should train together. Through the use of multi-agency drills, they become familiar with each other's procedures and capabilities. Some departments have taken this concept to the point that they have joint recruit training academies. When people go through the academy together, they get to know each other from the very beginning. They are well versed in the procedures of all the departments involved. This also helps prevent the bad feelings that sometimes arise between departments operating in proximity to one another. Joint training also occurs between the fire department and the private sector. Industrial fire brigades train with the fire department regularly. This gives the fire brigade the benefit of the firefighting expertise of the fire department. The fire department gains information on the processes protected by the private fire brigade. Now let's discuss ambulance companies. A group that is sometimes overlooked when joint training takes place is the local ambulance company, as you can see below in Figure 9-2. Joint training benefits both firefighters and ambulance companies. Firefighters who are EMTs should be prepared to set up equipment so it can be started by an on-scene paramedic. Additionally, ambulance personnel require access to the patient when fire personnel are performing extrication, but they need to be taught the dangers of being unprotected from various hazards at an accident scene, like flammable liquids or broken glass. One example of training cooperation between fire departments and private ambulance companies is firefighters going through paramedic school. They work with an ambulance company personnel to gain the hours required to finish their paramedical clinical training. They can also attend base meetings, which will help them gain advanced medical training and exchange information and ideas with local paramedics. Base meetings are conducted because paramedics are required to keep their certification current by completing a prescribed number of continuing education units, CEUs, between recertification testings. Classes are presented regularly, and doctors and subject area specialists make presentations on burn treatment, snake bite, head injury, and other topics. Working around medical helicopters, also known as air ambulance, is another area that requires special training and coordination. Firefighters not used to working around helicopters are at great risk of injury without the required training. When the local department does not have its own helicopters, it is necessary to coordinate with air ambulance provider to receive the necessary training. Training can take place anywhere. The fire department does not require extensive props or facilities to train its personnel. Departments use locations that can provide realistic training sessions, and possible locations include things like buildings scheduled for demolition, departments who may contact local building owners when buildings are scheduled for demolition or to perform ventilation, firefighter rescue, or other drill scenarios. The most important thing is that the drill be organized and conducted in a safe manner. Realism is good, but being too realistic, such as setting a building on fire with personnel on an upper floor, is unnecessarily dangerous. There should always be a qualified safety officer designated and a plan of operations in place prior to any training that may result in injuries from being experienced. Classrooms. When people are comfortable and distractions are limited, they learn better. When dealing with technical material, dry erase boards or other means of display are often necessary. Now, as far as a drill tower is concerned, a training or a drill tower can be used for ladder training, both ground and truck mounted. Drill towers also allow practice for operations in multi-story structures. When the department does not have a drill tower, a multi-level parking structure can serve the same purpose. Now let's talk about a burn building. The burn building provides a controlled environment where operations can be performed at little risk to personnel. Through the use of smoke machines and small fires, the burning building can last for years and provide much valuable training. Then there's also a drafting pit. These are necessary for pumper testing and can double as a training prop for pump operator skills testing certification. By varying the level of water in the pit, the difficulty of the drafting procedure can be adjusted. By assigning a person to oversee the annual pump testing and sending operators with their equipment, the operation can serve as a refresher course on drafting as well as completion of pumper tests. Now, in terms of training facilities, these are necessary as the modern fire service continues to take on new responsibilities. Hazardous materials props are expensive to construct and take up large amounts of room. So these types of facilities are usually provided on a regional basis. And you see an example of hazmat training below in Figure 9-3. The required props include leaking pipes, flanges, chlorine cylinders, etc. Railroad tank cars are another necessary prop for these facilities. The props are plumbed with compressed air and water to simulate pressure leaks. The props need to be as realistic as possible while providing a measure of safety for personnel. For example, it is extremely difficult to do anything in a fully encapsulated suit, especially climbing ladders and working on top of tank cars. It's a long way to the ground if you slip. Therefore, practice under controlled conditions is necessary to prepare personnel to respond safely in high hazard situations. Now let's talk about electronic media studio. These studios allow fire departments to edit videos taken during training sessions. Once edited and prepared, the videos can be reproduced and sent out to the stations so every engine company can gain at least some value from the training, even if they could not attend the actual drill. Now let's talk about off-site training. Off-site training can be conducted in numerous locations. Every time you complete a fire prevention inspection, you are performing training. When an alarm comes in at 2 a.m. and you enter the office you inspected last week, you will stand a better chance of finding your way around in the dark. Even the simple operation of driving around in your first-in area serves as training. As you become more familiar with streets and traffic patterns in your area, your response times will be lowered. Wildland fire training is a prime example of off-site training use, and it serves several purposes. Most importantly, it allows personnel to train in wildland firefighting. It provides for a safe, controlled place for personnel to train in suppressing fires in a wildland setting. For wildland firefighting training, the site will need to be prepared in a number of ways. Provisions must be made to keep the fire within the drill site, and adequate personnel, equipment, and water supply must be available. The site must be surveyed for safety hazards and prepared before any fires are lit. The topographical features that pose a hazard should be identified and brought to the attention of all participants. In areas with oil field operations, grassy areas should be searched for rocks, pipes, holes, and pumping unit foundations that may not be readily visible. These areas may contain overhead electrical wires, and because electricity can arc through smoke, they should definitely be avoided. All power poles should have the grass removed around the bases so fire does not spread to them. And there's an example of a firefighter clearing grass around a pole on Figure 9-4. Fence lines with wooden posts must be protected to prevent damage. High heat will weaken barbed wire fences, and fuel should be reduced or removed underneath them. Basically, anything that you do not want to burn should have the immediate area surrounding it adequately cleared before any fires are lit. Piles of tumbleweeds and other high heat producing fuels must be considered in planning the drill. Another advantage to wildland fire drills is the reduction of existing hazards. For example, during training, areas where certain roadsides suffer numerous fires during the dry season may be able to be burned off. This can provide a buffer zone that helps vehicle fires so they do not spread to wildland or grazing lands. Bear in mind that vegetation may be coated with pesticides, particularly in agriculture area, after aerial and ground spraying. Vegetation firefighting is often done without breathing apparatus, and the presence of pesticides can be an unseen hazard. In areas with high-rise structure under construction, it may be possible to secure permission to drill in the building on a weekend or holiday. Before the floor and wall finishes and furnishings are installed, hoses can be dragged around with little chance of damage to the structure. The drill can also acquaint engine and truck company personnel with construction methods used in the building. As with any other type of drill, proper pre-planning is necessary to provide maximum training during the time allotted and to provide for personnel safety. The drill area should be checked for electrical and other hazards. Vertical shafts must be secured, including any hole large enough for someone to fall into. Another opportunity to engage in training is during your pre-planned inspections of the high hazard occupancies in your district. These walkthroughs usually require the participation of several engine companies and serve as an opportunity to put some hose on the ground. With several companies at the drill site, one engine can remove its hose load and all hands can help get it back into service. During the pre-plan, building construction, hazards, strategy, and the tactics can all be discussed and reviewed, and you see an example of this below in Figure 9-5. This is also a good time to test communications from inside the building to the outside. In some structures, handheld radios are unable to transmit or receive. With the use of a smoke generator, search and rescue drills can be conducted in different types of buildings. When the proper type of smoke machine is used, there is no residue, and the drill can be very realistic from a visibility standpoint. The only thing lacking is the heat. Firefighters can also place a piece of wax paper over the mask of the SCBA to simulate low visibility in lieu of smoke machines. The advantage of this method is that the instructors can easily observe the actions of the personnel performing the drill. In areas with harbors, ships are a hazard that must be addressed, as this type of firefighting has a lot of serious hazards not present in other structure types. Fires below deck can turn ships into a multi-level basement fire that is particularly hard to ventilate. There's always the possibility of falling down one of the ladders that serve as stairs between decks. This drill should also include close inspection of the various types of ships one is likely to encounter. Although locations will vary, somewhere in the ship there should be a fire control plan. Now, communications can be a problem, as many ships have non-English speaking crews, and the metal structure of the hull tends to prevent handheld radio communication. Aircraft fighting has special techniques and hazards. The equipment used at major airports is specifically designed for the suppression of fires in aircraft, as you see below, Figure 9-6. Personnel have to be trained in attack, rescue, extinguishment, and overhaul in an airport setting. To learn how to operate the radios and how to deal with control tower requires extensive training. The personnel must be trained to operate safely around propeller and jet aircraft. Training in oil firefighting is a requirement for firefighters working in areas that have oil refining or production. Due to the large volumes of smoke produced by these types of live fire training facilities, they must be placed far away from any residential areas. The primary purpose of instruction is to change behavior. The first day on the job firefighter may be unfamiliar with fire engines, and he or she certainly does not know how to use a wide variety of tools and equipment effectively. One of the most important jobs in any department is the thorough training of personnel. The personnel have the right to demand good training. One of the most important aspects of any training program is safety. In fact, it's really the most important aspect. It is not just enough to show individuals how to perform an operation. They must be instructed in how to perform it safely. When safety is not stressed from the very first training that you receive, when else can you be expected to learn it? Certainly not on a fire scene. There are many ways to perform most operations, but only a very few safe ways to do so. Safety must be included and stressed in every training session, and you will hear it relentlessly, but you've got to remember, this is your life on the line. So full attentiveness in all training is absolutely key. It is also extremely important that firefighters develop a safety attitude overall, as I just mentioned, because it helps to protect them and the other firefighters working with them. Some parts of the firefighter's job are practiced to the point that they literally become habit. However, just because it may become habit doesn't mean that you do not still need to pay full attention every time. It becomes habit because you've repeated it so many times. However, each fire is different, so you can't just out of habit do things a certain way or become lax. You still have to be as attentive with safety, no matter how habitual something might become. The act of donning an SCBA over and over and over until you perform all of the steps to develop specification is a good example. The idea that people will do as they are trained, even under times of extreme stress, is why repetition of training is so important, because you fall back on your training. And that training is why it is so important that it's done well and with full safety, because anyone who's ever been in the military, law enforcement, EMT, any kind of situation where they've experienced situations of extreme duress or stress, they'll tell you that they just fall back on their training. And that is part of the idea, as well as to give you expertise, of course. Now, the actions you take, such as donning an SCBA, should be so familiar that you can almost do them without thinking. This way, your mind will be occupied with thoughts of how to rescue a trapped person, not whether or not you remembered to test your face mask seal when donning your SCBA. So that's just one example. Another area that must become so ingrained that it is habit is scene size up. When faced with devastation, it is important you're able to size up the situation and determine the proper course of action to take. Rushing blindly into a bad situation is just going to make it worse for everyone involved. Not just worse, potentially deadly. As you move up in the rank structure and are expected to come up with a plan and assign resources, this training becomes even more important. Your decisions will not just affect your life, you've got your others to think of as well. In addition to developing habits for simple tasks, you will also need to develop the ability to think things through under extreme pressure. Training yourself to think in a logical and orderly fashion in emergency situations will help you develop a command presence. Persons with command presence seem very cool and collected no matter how stressful the situation is, and they know how to deal with stress and pressure. They do not yell or use profanity on the fire ground. They keep their wits about them and perform in an orderly and decisive fashion. People who are calm and collected tend to have the same effect on those around them. Conversely, the opposite is true. If you lose your cool, everybody else is going to lose it too. As you become better trained and more experienced in the performance of your job, you will develop the necessary knowledge to make changes to your plan if it's not working. Knowing what other methods and tools are available to handle situation is really critical. As you progress, you should be capable of devising different strategies and tactics to handle situations. For example, you will be able to determine whether an offensive or defensive attack is the best strategy for the fire you're in charge of. You should also develop the ability to determine which areas of the plan need to be changed and how to implement the changes. You've got to make sure that you're cool and collected so that you can adapt. Like if the wind shifts, for instance, that can have serious consequences. So you have to be collected and have a keen eye, keep your wits about you so that you can make quick and proper decisions and reform a particular attack. Becoming a well-rounded firefighter and incident commander does not happen overnight. It takes many hours of study and years of experience. Not all fire-related training is manipulative training, as you see below in Figure 9-7. The world is changing at a rapid pace, so firefighters must be trained to deal with various hazards and new challenges. So the training that we were talking about before now is manipulative training, where you get out, you learn how to do ventilation, you learn how to do ladder drills, You learn how to don SCBAs and turnouts and everything properly. That's all manipulative training. So now we're talking about technical training. So to perform fire prevention functions, firefighters must be able to read and interpret codes and ordinances. They must be able to speak and write well. Good English is crucial. Every document you generate is a legal document, and most of them are public. So it is crucial that you notate everything well with very good English, with excellent grammar, and proper writing. They are also required to come across as professional and knowledgeable when dealing with the public, and this can greatly affect how they are perceived. Much of the hazardous materials training is technical. Learning chemistry requires study and effort. Learning how to select correct personnel protective equipment, PPE, is not only technical, it is also a life-saving concern. Hazardous materials teams personnel must be able to perform tests on samples and categorize chemicals. And one example you see is the training taking place below in figure 9-8. This requires observing the results of tests and making decisions. Much of the learning in the EMS field is technical too. You must learn about the human body and its systems. Paramedics learn how to read and interpret electrocardiograms, EKGs, and what information to pass on to base hospital so the proper drugs can be administered. On the manipulative side, you will be required to learn how to immobilize spinal injuries and properly package victims for removal and transport from the accident scene. Building construction also requires technical instruction. Looking at photos and visiting construction sites can provide you with the knowledge required regarding the relative strengths, weaknesses, and problems encountered with various types of roof construction. This information is essential when determining whether it's safe to get on a roof to perform ventilation and where to place holes. Technical training on the application rates and coverage areas of extinguishing agents is essential for effective usage. Extinguishing agents are based on both chemical and physical reactions. The knowledge of simply spraying an agent on fire is not enough. You should understand what is happening and why. You must be able to choose the right agent for the type of fire and determine whether there is enough on hand to attack or if you should wait for more to arrive. A situation in which you use up the foam on site and do not extinguish a fire could easily arise. As you wait for more foam to arrive, the fire may come back to its full intensity. When foam does not arrive, you will not have enough to extinguish the fire. If you had waited a few minutes for the reinforcements to arrive, the first try would have been successful. It's also necessary to know how extinguishing systems are designed when inspecting or supporting them. It is not enough to know that pipe A connects to pipe B. You must understand how the valve system works. You must be able to figure out whether you can adequately support the system based on how many sprinkler heads are open. And an example of that is a sprinkler system riser cutaways that show internal parts of valves, and that's the figure you see here, 9-9. You must also be capable of using the command structure to request more units to assist you when water source is inadequate. A thorough knowledge of the incident command system is used by your department and is critical. Not only do you need to know how to initiate the system as the initial attack incident commander, you need to know whom to contact to get the things you need. The most important area of technical training is safety, of course. You must be knowledgeable about the design limitations of all of your equipment, including PPE, SCBA, etc. Just because it's good protection doesn't mean it's foolproof protection. For instance, if you are in an enclosed space with a fire burning low and you see the smoke layers above you, smoke is flammable, and sometimes these temperatures can rise very high. So, for example, if you're in a confined space like that, if you raise your head above a certain height into one of these smoke layers, it can melt your helmet. So there are limitations to your equipment. So knowledge of it is very important. And the situation I was just talking about is a potential flashover. And so
knowledge of flashover and also backdraft can save your life. You need to know the limitations of the equipment you're using. All apparatus has limitations as to what it can do. A good operator knows the design limitations thoroughly. Fire equipment is furnished with all manner of tools. The use and application of these tools is an important part of your training. So you'll get manipulative training, but prior to actually using all these tools, you have to do some technical study and training first. For example, when dealing with forcible entry tools, the study of locks, their construction, and the removal methods are technical information. It is difficult to gain access to locks of all different types that you may encounter in your career. So you need to know as much as possible so that you can adapt on scene if you've run into a difficult lock, for example. Although a thorough knowledge of the communication system is necessary, it must be performed efficiently. In large departments, numerous channels may be used. It is necessary to know what channel to switch to when performing on an emergency. In departments with large geographic areas, the radio system may have repeaters. It may be necessary to turn off one repeater and turn on another to have clear communications when operating in certain areas. Your ability to use the system correctly and effectively can have a definite effect on the outcome of incident operations. And when we're talking about technical training, this is a lot of the classroom time that you're going to be spending learning about radio systems, PPE, tools, hoses, lays, etc. So that is, and radio comms is, of course, another example of what you'll learn in the classroom, and then you'll get out and practice with it. Another area of communications that require technical training is written communications within the department. Most departments have forms made up for different purposes. Supplies from central stores for an oil change for the engine often requires different forms, such as a fire report form. If the form is not filled out correctly, the information needed will not be available for planning purposes and for developing statistical information. And that statistical information is important for budgetary reasons, etc. With manipulative training, which I talked about technical versus manipulative, we're going to talk about manipulative training now. With manipulative training, you're performing hands-on operations of equipment and tools, and an example is practicing with this circular saw for forcible entry, as you see below in figure 9-10. Examples of manipulative training include advancing hose lines or donning SCBA during initial training. One of the rules of manipulative training is that it is perfect practice leads to perfect performance. You will be required to perform simple operations again and again under the watchful eye of your instructor according to the department guidelines. You will be watched closely and corrected at any misstep to make sure you do things correctly. And it's not always that you've done it incorrectly, but you might have done it out of order. And just that order that you do things in is crucially important. Performing drills with hose and other equipment is called performing evolutions. When you go for training, they'll be called training evolutions or performance evolutions. At first, they'll be very simple and involve performing only one task. For example, pulling off the supply hose. As you progress, they will include combinations of tasks. And an example of that is exiting the apparatus, donning your SCBA, and advancing a hose line to the door of the burn building. As you become proficient at the steps of evolution, they will become more and more complex. By the end of your initial training and assignment to operations, you should be able to show up at the correct location with the correct equipment and be ready to perform. Much of your time will be spent learning to operate the wide variety of tools carried on your assigned apparatus. You must become proficient to the point that you can operate these tools in the dark with limited visibility under stressful conditions. You should also be capable of minor repairs because equipment has a way of malfunctioning when it's most needed. Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. Properly cleaning the equipment after it is used is one way to become intimately familiar with the workings of each tool. And obviously, it's totally necessary as well. When you become an engine operator, you must be able to drive safely and perform all operations required at the pump panel. These operations can include hydrant hookups, drafting, relay pumping, supplying attack lines, and supplying master streams. You must be able to perform all of these operations under normal circumstances and troubleshoot if something malfunctions. This position requires a wide array of manipulative and technical knowledge. So a lot of study and a lot of practice. For example, you must not only be able to hook up everything correctly, but also be able to pump at the proper pressure. Ladder truck operators have many of the same requirements. Realistic conditions will be sought for manipulative training. Drills should not be conducted only during good weather and under optimum circumstances. Drilling at night is performed to acquaint firefighters with actual conditions under which they will commonly work. Performing drills in darkness stresses the need to be intimately familiar with your equipment. You may have great lighting, but you'll also have great shadows. So it's really important to almost essentially be able to feel your way around as well as see your way around. When crews drill only during the day, they tend to forget about setting up adequate lighting, as I just mentioned, during night operations. Other advantages that are at some of the locations, such as commercial areas that would not be available for practice during the day, are available when the stores are closed and traffic is at a minimum. When dealing with people who have already mastered the basics, stress drills may be performed. When performing stress drills, the drill site is selected to be as close as possible to realistic conditions. The purpose of stress drills is to practice skills under extreme conditions, but not get someone hurt. Now, there are different types of stress drills. For example, drilling with an SCBA in pitch black smoky room or a maze. The claustrophobia that can set in when confronted with total darkness with an SCBA mask on your face can be intimidating and really frightening. The way to keep yourself from panicking when faced with this situation is practice. This is one of those examples I mentioned earlier where you fall back on your training. Don't panic. Take a beat and think. Familiarity with this type of situation may absolutely save your life when confronted with it for real. Performing rescue in a confined space, as you see below in figure 9-11, can feel very claustrophobic, and this type of situation must be practiced when wearing an SCBA or a supplied air respirator, SAR, as well. The firefighter must get used to the limited mobility of working in tight spaces. And you've got to remember, when you're working in that tight space, you got a tank on your back and other equipment as well. So how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Confined spaces may include also, but are not limited to, underground vaults, tanks, storage bins, pit and diked areas, vessels, sewers, and silos. Searching for and rescuing a downed firefighter when performing SCBA is a possible drill. Dragging someone in full turnout gear and wearing an SCBA is very hard to do. The victim must wear full PPE to avoid injury as you drag him or her out. Trying to find someone in smoke and darkness should reinforce that you need to activate your personal alarm device, your PAL or PASS, whenever you're entering a building. You may think that you can find the other firefighters by the sound of their breathing through their SCBA. The problem is that your SCBA and your partners are both making the same noise. So when the person you're searching for has his personal alarm activated, though, you may just be able to locate and drag him out before either of you run out of breathing air. Performing wildland fire construction and pretending that crews are about to be overrun by the fire is another type of training evolution. When this happens, they must proceed to the safety zone or deployment site and deploy their fire shelters. This drill should be performed only without fire present. The drill must include shedding tools, packs, fuel bottles, and fuses. The personnel then deploy and take up position in their shelters. The drill should be performed in as realistic conditions as possible. The hard run to the deployment site aids in realism, and the instructors yelling at them to hurry adds to the stress. Realism is increased when performing in a location that has high winds. Several power fans can provide sufficient wind to simulate real condition when winds are light or non-existent when you go to train. the practice of having the crew deploy and lighting a fire that actually overruns their position is dangerous and unnecessary. Your level of physical fitness will become evident during your performance of stress-type drills. When making the run uphill to the safety zone or dragging a firefighter around, your overall fitness is tested. It is much better to find out beforehand that you need to work out more than it is to find this out under life-threatening conditions. Even in stress-type drills, safety is still the #1 priority. For example, to perform search and rescue drills, you do not need to set the building on fire for realism. The skills to be practiced are search and rescue, not putting out the fire. It would be extremely dangerous to place someone in a burning building, leave him alone, and tell him not to come out till he's found. The instructor must remember the purpose of the training and determine the safest way to perform the drill without unnecessarily endangering the safety of the attendees. Several criteria must be considered when determining adequate levels of training. The first criterion for determining the adequate level of training for any job is whether it is being performed safely. Again, safety, safety, safety. All personnel who perform the job must be able to perform it in the safest manner possible. The second criterion is whether the steps are being performed in the proper sequence, and I mentioned that earlier. Jobs vary in complexity, and this has an effect on the adequate level of training needed. A simple job may require only minimal training, whereas a complex job with many steps, such as raising an aerial ladder, will require more training. Complex jobs have many steps that must be performed in the proper sequence, and they must be done in the safest way possible. The third criterion is with what frequency the job is to be performed. Some jobs are performed on a regular basis, such as donning SCBA and advancing attack lines. In the initial training period, these will be focused on heavily. When you're to the point that you can perform them almost automatically within department guidelines and in a safe manner, the focus will shift to more complex operations. As you gain experience and skill, you will be required to learn jobs that are performed less frequently. Although firefighters drill in deploying their shelters, many firefighters are never required to perform this operation under real conditions. However, there is no excuse not to master the skill. Literally, you never know what's going to happen. And, I mean, you can have a good idea, but as I mentioned before, every single fire scene is different, inherently different. And so you could find yourself, after 10 years, suddenly having to use an emergency shelter. So, as I was saying, it's no excuse not to master even rarely used types of operations. Firefighting it never has been a routine job, and every incident, as I mentioned, presents a different situation. Department policies, and in many cases the law, require that personnel be trained to a minimum of a prescribed standard. To achieve maximum effectiveness, personnel should be trained beyond the minimum level for efficiency and safety reasons. For example, the minimal acceptable level for wildland firefighters is 32 hours of training. This is enough to put them out on the line in a relatively non-hazardous location, but it is not enough to place them in front of an active wildland fire that is exhibiting erratic behavior. The basic underlying factor that determines performance standards for any job is whether it was performed correctly. In other words, it should be performed within department guidelines as to time and safety with a minimum of errors. Time is one of the most commonly used criteria for setting performance standards. The department specifies that evolutions require a single skill or combination of skills and must be performed within a time limit. A good example of that is, aside from any fire training videos you may have already watched, is if you watch drills on, like, submarines, for instance, you will see them time the drill, not fast enough. Time the drill, not fast enough. A sub is a completely enclosed space, so they do a lot of fire drills on subs and other types of drills, and they do it literally all the time, and they have to master these skills to be under a certain time level to exceed the minimum standard. And that's the same type of expectation you have with fire training as well. An example is a universal standard that you are able to don SCBA under 1 minute. This is kind of one of those fun things where you can set up with a team partner and go for it. See who can beat who and the quickest time, and beat that 1 minute, but safely, adequately, properly, with all the correct steps. With too much emphasis placed on time, however, competition can develop between crew members and companies, and safety can be sacrificed for speed. That's just the example I gave you. So you can practice drilling each other, and it can be light competition, but make sure, again, as I just said, that you're doing it safely, properly, etc. And here's another example. When raising ladders, for example, one of the primary steps is to look up before raising the ladder. When personnel compete against each other in a drill tower for time with no hazards such as overhead wires present, the drill emphasizes speed over safety. But this can have life or death consequences for the firefighter who raises a ladder without looking up to see if charged wires are overhead. There is much discussion among training officers as to what percentage of errors is acceptable. Some are satisfied with a passing grade of 70%, while others think it should be 80%. Realistically, the percentage should vary with respect to the importance of the material being tested. For example, an error on a fire report is not going to cost anyone his life or property. But when it comes to safety, the acceptable error level is 0%, which is referred to as zero tolerance. If an acceptable level of error was 20%, then it would be acceptable for someone to be injured 2 out of every 10 responses. And if you think about that, that's totally not acceptable. This rate is unacceptable not only from a moral standpoint, but also a financial standpoint. Part of the professional attitude of a modern firefighter is that they approach their jobs with due consideration for the consequences of their actions. Now let's talk about skill development, maintenance, and assessment. Skill is the ability to use one's knowledge effectively and readily in execution or performance. It is a developed aptitude or ability. You're not expected to be skilled upon arrival at a fire department, but you are expected to become skilled through instruction, study, and practice. You're also expected to be physically fit in order to perform the skills you're taught. A master is someone who serves as a model or ideal. Your goal as a student is to achieve mastery of the tasks expected of you. When training a person to the level of mastery, each individual task is required to be performed as a set standard. Scores achieved on individual parts of a test are not averaged. In this type of training, the emphasis is on performing the tasks correctly, not on time. As a firefighter, you're expected to be able to perform at a consistently high level after a very short time. This job requires that you exhibit mastery of at least the basic tasks, such as donning your PPE or performing suppression activities. In a normal fire situation, everyone, including your supervisor, is very busy, and the price you pay for making a mistake can be very high. As you master the basic sequence of skills, you will soon be expected to be able to deal with more complicated situations. This requires the application of both manipulative and technical skills. Firefighting is a dynamic process, and the situation is subject to change rapidly, and you will be expected to adapt your operations accordingly. For example, in a situation where a wildland fire is spreading to the roof of a structure, you cannot limit yourself to one aspect of the situation. You must be able to tie together all of your training and experience in both wildland and structure firefighting and act appropriately. All situations will require decision making. This is critical thinking. The major burden of the decision falls on the supervisor, but they're not always standing next to you or easily accessible. You must be able to become proficient to the point where you can begin to take appropriate action while they're being notified. At the very least, you should be capable of recognizing the hazards present and not unnecessarily endanger your safety or that of others on your crew. Now we'll talk about the maintenance aspect. After you have mastered your basic skills and moved on to more complicated operations, you must maintain your proficiency at every skill, even the basics. Once you have mastered something, the tendency is to take for granted that you're still capable of performing it at a high level, but this is not true for most people. The only way to maintain skill level is to review and practice constantly. Now we'll talk about the assessment aspect. Once skills are learned, the ability of the student to perform is then assessed. This is done through testing performed on both technical and manipulative skills. Many different types of testing are used, including the pencil and paper test or verbal or oral testing. For example, an exam about ladders could require you to name all the parts when given a drawing, or you could be asked to name all the parts when looking at one lying on the ground. As a form of technical testing at the station level, the company officer observing will judge how proficient you are at filling out reports and doing other required paperwork. In manipulative testing, you'll be expected to perform operations and evolutions in front of an evaluator. This occurs all the time at the station level. The company officer will have the crew perform a drill to evaluate the performance of the personnel and assess training needs. If the crew is slow or hesitant in performing the required operations, more time should be spent in practicing to increase proficiency. The company officer will also want the crew to perform the drill well when the chief requests it. Otherwise, the company officer will receive guidance from the chief if the crew is inefficient or sloppy. At the end of your initial training, you may receive a comprehensive manipulative and technical examination. The manipulative test requires you to show a high level of proficiency in the skills you're expected to perform. The technical test is to determine whether you learn the policies, procedures, rules, and regulations of the department. There may also be specialized testing in the areas of hazardous materials and emergency medicine. Departments that have structured post-academy training programs for new firefighters typically have a manipulative and technical test at the end of a probationary period. In many cases, you're required to complete this test successfully to complete probation and retain your position within the fire department. A reason for getting companies together in performance testing is the one department concept that we mentioned earlier. Companies from different areas of the department's jurisdiction are expected to be able to perform together as one cohesive team. This helps departments identify discrepancies in training and inefficiencies in how the companies operate together. Since equipment and apparatus are standardized, any firefighter should be able to approach any station's apparatus and locate a tool at any time, or any combination of personnel should be able to advance hose line off of the apparatus. As a tip, at a typical drill, several engine companies are brought together at one location and told to perform a coordinated attack. This drill requires that they support each other's operations with personnel and equipment. When there are vast differences in the way operations are performed, or there is a lot of discussion about how to complete the task, it is immediately evident they are not trained to perform the operations the same way. And that will be addressed. The way to achieve unity and coordination is through the use of standard operating procedures, SOPs, or guidelines. SOPs are written procedures that specify what companies will do when they arrive at the emergency scene. SOPs are developed to apply to the areas of command, communications, safety, tactical priorities, and utilization of companies. If you think about it, in the military, you've got units that come together from various locations, bases or forts from across the nation, who find themselves having to work together at a particular scene or a battle, for example. They've all had the exact same training, the exact same set of SOPs, etc. So even though they've never met each other, they're able to perform effectively. And that's essentially what you guys are going to find yourselves doing. You're going to be working with people you've never met in your life. So the fact that standard operating procedures are in place is why you must know them and know them properly, because their lives are in your hands and vice versa at a fire scene. Here is an example of a set of standard operating procedures. This is just an example. So your company, your jurisdiction, your municipality, etc., will have its set of standard complete set of standard operating procedures, and they're going to vary somewhat, like from state to state, for instance, because of heavy snow versus desert terrain. But within your jurisdiction, area, or department, you're going to have the same SOPs so that you can support each other in a multiple unit or multiple coded incident. And so this is just one example of a standard operating procedure. With the inclusion of SOPs, the department can function more smoothly because the incident commander knows what to expect from arriving companies. It also reduces the need for fire-ground communications because the incident commander does not have to spell out everything required of the companies at the scene. It can also be used as a standard drill to build and test any company proficiencies. A necessary step in the training process is maintaining training records. Records are necessary to document that training was received by the personnel involved and how they performed. Over a period of time, these records can be reviewed. Areas of greater need can then be assessed, and the department can identify areas in which training was lacking or sometimes missed altogether. Here's an example of a training record. It's going to look a little different depending on which department or jurisdiction you ultimately end up working in, but this is one example. When operations go especially right or wrong, the training records can be accessed to determine the reason. Numerous government regulations and laws require that firefighters receive training in specified areas, and training records help verify that required subjects were covered. When the department is called to court to justify its actions in a case, the training records of personnel involved will be requested. As I mentioned before, all the forms that you fill out, even training evolutions, are all legal documents. Some governmental programs, such as apprenticeship programs, provide funding to reimburse departments for training costs. These records must be maintained on the hours spent training. The overall purpose of training is instant effectiveness, which can be described in the following ways. Operations are performed efficiently and safely. The incident is controlled with minimum loss, and everyone returns to the station without injury. The best trained engine company in the world will not be able to put out every fire upon its arrival, nor will it be able to save every life. However, by being properly trained, it will be able to perform to a high level and make as much impact as possible with the resources available. The modern firefighter is required to be skilled in many areas of emergency operations. The public expects firefighters to be able to handle just about any situation that arises. Federal requirements for hazardous materials training are referred to in the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, also known as SARA, of 1986. Part 1920 TAC 120, Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, requires firefighters and other first responders to hazardous materials incidents to have first responder awareness training. You'll learn more about the different levels of hazardous material training as you progress through your firefighting classes. This training is required for personnel who are likely to witness or discover a hazardous substance release and who have been trained to initiate an emergency response sequence by notifying the proper authorities of the release. They are required to have an understanding of what hazardous materials are and the risks associated with them in an incident, an understanding of the potential outcomes associated with an emergency created with a hazardous substance is released, and then the ability to recognize the presence of hazardous substances in an emergency. Also, they must be able to identify the hazardous substance if possible, an understanding of the role of the first responder awareness individual in the employer's emergency response plan, and the ability to use the DOT, Department of Transportation, Emergency Response Guidebook. The ability to realize the need for additional resources and to make appropriate notifications to the communication center is also required. First responder operations level, FRO personnel, are those who respond to releases or potential releases as part of the initial response to the site for the purpose of protecting persons, property, or the environment. Now, we just mentioned the first responder awareness training. That is the lowest level of training, but I just read to you the guidelines for FRA, or first responder awareness level training. This next level is FRO, first responder operations training. And first responder operations level FRO personnel, again, are those who respond to releases or potential releases as part of the initial response to the site for the purpose of protecting persons, property, or the environment. They have slightly more training as over FRA, or awareness, and operators, first responder operation level, are trained to act in the defensive mode without actually trying to stop the release. But they are trained to contain the release from a safe distance, do their best to keep it from spreading, and prevent exposures, basically to isolate, identify, and deny entry to the area where the release has occurred. In addition to the requirements of the awareness level that I talked before about FRA, at the FRO level, they're required to know basic hazard and risk assessment techniques, how to select and use proper PPE provided for the FRO level, and basic hazardous materials terms. They also must know how to perform control, containment, and/or confinement operations, and then how to rescue injured or contaminated persons within the capabilities of the resources and PPE available within their unit. How to implement basic equipment, victim, and rescue personnel decontamination procedures they must also know, along with relevant operating procedures and termination procedures. Title 29 of the CFR goes on to specify the training requirements for the more highly trained positions of hazardous materials technician, specialist, and incident commander / on-scene manager. The average firefighters should be trained to at least the FRO level, as they're expected to take action when they respond to the incident. But part of that training too is knowing that you need to call the technicians and specialists. Recognizing the situation, what's been released, identifying it, etc., and know who to call and when. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, specifies the training requirements for aircraft firefighting personnel in the FAA Regulations, Part 139. The personnel involved in this type of operation are required to be initially and recurrently trained in the following: airport familiarization, aircraft familiarization, rescue and firefighting, personnel safety, and emergency comms or communication systems in the airport, including fire alarms. They must also know equipment use, including use of the fire hoses, nozzles, turrets, and other appliances required for compliance with Part 139. They also need to know the application of the types of extinguishing agents required for compliance with Part 139. Emergency aircraft evacuation assistance, firefighting operations, adapting and using structural rescue and firefighting equipment for aircraft rescue and firefighting, and familiarization with firefighters' duties under the airport emergency plan. And all rescue and firefighting personnel must participate in at least one live fire drill every 12 months. But most departments actually do it much more frequently. At least one of the personnel on duty must be trained and current in basic emergency medical care, including at least 40 hours of training that covers bleeding, cardiopulmonary resuscitation CPR, shock, primary patient survey, injuries to the skull, spine, chest, and extremities, internal injuries, moving patients, burns, and triage. In the area of EMS, requirements are set on the state or local level. As the level of medical expertise increases, so do the training hours and requirements. There is no set time to be spent on firefighting skills maintenance. A standard rule of thumb is 2 hours of drill per day. Skills to be practiced include the following: hose evolutions, use of PPE, use of tools, and use of apparatus. Safety is of the utmost importance to training. I think I've said that in a quite redundant fashion, but deliberately in this chapter. Training accidents have occurred, and without constant vigilance, they will continue to occur. Training injuries can be grouped into several main areas. Falls, typically from ladders or roofs, being stuck by apparatus, heavy equipment, and falling objects, overexertion that can lead to heart attack, thermal stress, and dehydration, burns during live fire training, or carbon monoxide poisoning, carbon monoxide CO. You must know some of these chemicals by their proper name. Injuries from training accidents have ranged from minor to fatal. However, through proper use of PPE, planning, and vigilance, most, if not all, injuries should be avoidable. You must be able to size up a situation and decide how to approach it without endangering your life or someone else's. Part of this comes from developing a safety attitude and having zero tolerance for safety violations. When you exhibit this safety attitude, you set the example for those around you. Okay, class, we covered a fair amount of things in this chapter, so we're going to go through the summary, and of course, do not ever rely solely on the PowerPoint lectures because they're supplemental to your text. So do make sure that you're studying your text as well as just listening to these lectures. However, these are quite important. So that being said, let's go through the summary of what we covered in this chapter. First, we'll start with this. Without training, firefighters are inefficient, possibly ineffective, and exposed to greater risk than necessary. Regardless of the size and capabilities of the department's training staff, firefighters are ultimately responsible for their own safety and education. Without the training staff, the operations personnel may not have the required training to perform safely, efficiently, and in compliance with the law. The overall requirements for a training officer can be divided into aptitude and attitude. In terms of aptitude, the training officer must be able to plan effectively. The training officer should also have a positive attitude concerning the importance of training. Having the head of training bureau hold a high-ranking position such as chief lends more authority to his or her decisions when it comes to requiring personnel to assist or participate in training programs. Departments that have a chief officer in charge of training usually have company officers as the primary training officers who schedule the training, arrange the programs, and perform the actual instruction and needs assessment. Instructors in a training bureau can be from the same department or multiple departments or from related agencies such as ambulance companies. With the increased use of video and other electronic media in today's training environment, an electronic media technician is a valuable resource for any training bureau. Light duty gives the department a way to employ personnel while they are on injury leave and gives the personnel exposure to what is required for training and other staff positions. One of the finest examples of training cooperation is when the fire department jointly trains with other agencies. These agencies can be federal, state, or local. Joint training creates an atmosphere of mutual respect among all concerned, and ambulance personnel require access to the patient when fire personnel are performing extrication. This is another reason that joint training is so important. And they need to be taught the dangers of being unprotected from flammable liquids, broken glass, and sharp metal edges at an accident scene. So there should always be a qualified safety officer designated and a plan of operations in place prior to any training that may result in injuries being experienced. In just about any area, off-site training can be conducted in numerous locations, for example, high-rise buildings and wildland. One of the most important jobs in any department is the thorough training of personnel. The personnel have the right to demand good training, and the department has the obligation to provide it. The world is changing at a rapid pace, and so are the hazards and situations that firefighters must face in the line of duty, so firefighters must be trained to meet the new challenges. Manipulative training differs from technical training in that you're performing hands-on operations of equipment and tools. The first criterion for determining the adequate level of training for any job is whether it is being performed safely. All personnel who perform the job must be able to perform it in the safest manner possible. The basic underlying factor that determines the performance standard for any job is whether it was performed correctly, which means that it was performed within department guidelines as to time and safety and with a minimum of errors. When you come to work for the fire department, you're not expected to be completely skilled. You're expected to be able to become skilled through instruction, study, and practice. After you've mastered your basic skills and moved on to more complicated operations, you must maintain your proficiency at every skill, even the basics. Once skills are learned, the ability of the student to perform them must be assessed. This is done through testing performed on both technical and manipulative skills. The way to achieve unity and coordination is through the use of standard operating procedures, SOPs, or guidelines. Training records are necessary for documenting that training was received by the personnel involved and how they were performed in that training. Over time, these records can be reviewed and areas of greater need can be assessed. The overall purpose of training is incident effectiveness. Under the concept of incident effectiveness, operations are performed efficiently and safely. The modern firefighter is required to be skilled in many areas of emergency operations. The public expects them to be able to handle just about any situation that arises. Injuries from training accidents have ranged from minor to fatal. Through the proper use of PPE, planning, and vigilance, most, if not all, of these types of injuries should be avoidable. Okay, class, that wraps up Chapter 9. As always, if you need clarification on anything, please contact your instructor. Make sure that you are using your text as your primary source for information. This is meant to be supplemental to support your knowledge of the text. And thank you for your attention, and we will see you next class.